There are names that echo through the dark corridors of our collective memory, names that have become synonymous with the very concept of evil. Bundy, Gacy, Dahmer. They are the archetypes of the modern monster, their faces and crimes plastered across documentaries, books, and podcasts. We study them, we analyze them, we try to comprehend the incomprehensible void that existed where a human soul should have been. But our focus on these infamous few has created a kind of shadow, a vast and chilling darkness where other monsters lurk, forgotten by history. These are the killers whose brutality equaled and, in many cases, far surpassed the household names. Their victim counts climb into the dozens, sometimes even the hundreds. Their methods were so depraved, their motives so alien, that they defy easy categorization.
Why have they been forgotten? Sometimes it was the era in which they lived, a time before forensic science, before the term serial killer even existed. Sometimes it was geography, their atrocities committed in corners of the world that Western media rarely illuminates. And sometimes, most disturbingly, it was because of who their victims were. The marginalized, the poor, the voiceless, whose disappearances barely caused a ripple in the wider society.
Tonight, we journey into that shadow. We will unearth the stories of the most savage serial killers you've never heard of. We will not only examine their horrific crimes, but also the worlds that created them and allowed them to flourish. This is a journey through centuries and across continents into the heart of a darkness that is all the more terrifying because it has remained hidden. These are the stories of the monsters who history chose to forget. Our first journey takes us back to a time of myth and legend, of knights and saints, of brutal, unending war. We travel to 15th century France, a land scarred by the 100 Years' War. It is an era where the lines between piety and superstition, valor and barbarism were perilously thin. And in this world of violent contradictions, one man stood as a paragon of its highest ideals, only to become a symbol of its deepest depravity. His name was Gilles de Rais, a name that should be remembered not just for his crimes, but for the staggering height from which he fell. He was not a shadowy drifter or a social outcast. He was a marshal of France, a wealthy and respected nobleman, a decorated war hero who fought valiantly alongside one of history's most iconic figures, Joan of Arc. He stood beside her at the Siege of Orleans, a shining example of French chivalry and courage. Imagine this man, at the peak of his prestige. He commanded armies, owned vast estates and multiple castles, and was a trusted advisor to the future King Charles VII. He was the embodiment of power and nobility in a world where such things placed a man almost beyond reproach. And yet, behind the walls of his magnificent castles, a different story was unfolding. A story of grotesque indulgence, forbidden knowledge, and a descent into a madness that would consume hundreds of innocent lives. The transition from celebrated hero to monstrous predator was not instantaneous. It was a slow, rotting decay that began after the end of his military career. With the war winding down and his comrade Joan of Arc executed, Gilles de Rais retired to his estates. He was a man of immense wealth and appetites, and he began to live a life of theatrical extravagance, staging elaborate plays and surrounding himself with a massive retinue of followers. This lifestyle was unsustainable, even for a man of his means. He began to sell off his lands and castles piece by piece to fund his lavish tastes. His family, alarmed by his profligacy, successfully petitioned the king to issue a decree forbidding him from selling any more of his inheritance. It was this financial desperation, this closing of legitimate avenues to wealth that seems to have pushed him over the edge, down a path he was perhaps already predisposed to walk. He turned to alchemy, the medieval pursuit of turning base metals into gold. This was not unusual for noblemen of the era, but for Gilles it became an obsession. He sought out alchemists, sorcerers, and men who claimed to have contact with the demonic. His quest for gold became a quest for forbidden, supernatural power. And it was in this murky world of occult ritual that his darker impulses found a horrifying new form of expression. His primary accomplice in this was a man named Francesco Prelati, an Italian cleric and magician who claimed he could summon a demon named Behram. Prelati convinced Gilles that the demon demanded offerings to reveal the secrets of wealth and power. These offerings, he claimed, could not be mere animals. The demon required the most potent sacrifice of all, the hands, eyes, and hearts of children. And so it began. Under the guise of hiring pages, choir boys, or servants, Gilles de Rais's men would scour the surrounding villages and countryside. They sought out children, primarily young boys, often from poor families who would be grateful for the opportunity for their son to serve a great lord. They were lured to one of his many castles, like the imposing Château de Tiffage, with promises of food, clothing, and a better life. Once they passed through the castle gates, they were never seen again. What happened within those stone walls is the stuff of the most extreme nightmares, known to us primarily through the chilling confessions of Gilles and his accomplices during their trial. The children were not simply killed. They were held captive, sometimes for days, subjected to the darkest whims of their captor. Gilles de Rais was a sadist of the highest order, deriving a perverse pleasure from the terror and suffering of his victims. The trial records paint a picture of unspeakable horror. The children were tortured, sexually assaulted, and ultimately murdered in ritualistic fashion. Gilles would often watch, sometimes participating, sometimes directing his loyal servants, Etienne Corriellart and Henriette Grisart, to carry out the acts. He confessed to finding an aesthetic pleasure in their death throes, in the contrast of their pale skin against the crimson of their blood. After they were dead, the bodies were dismembered. The parts demanded by the demon baron were used in Prelati's dark ceremonies, while the rest of the remains were burned in the castle's massive fireplaces or buried in hidden pits and deep castle latrines. The sheer number of victims is staggering and ultimately unknowable. During his trial, Gilles confessed to the murders of around 140 children, but the true number is believed to be far higher, with some estimates reaching as many as 800 over the course of 8 years. For nearly a decade, this slaughter continued unabated. How could a man of his prominence commit such atrocities on such a scale without being stopped? The answer lies in the very power and authority he wielded. He was a feudal lord, the master of his domain. The peasants and commoners in his lands were effectively his property. To question or accuse him was unthinkable and would have been suicidal. Furthermore, the victims were chosen carefully. They were the children of the poor, the transient, the powerless. In a brutal era where life was cheap and child mortality was high, a missing child from a peasant family was a personal tragedy, but it was not a matter for the authorities. There was no police force as we know it, no centralized system for reporting missing persons. The disappearances were isolated incidents, whispered rumors, and local fears that never coalesced into a formal investigation. It was Gilles de Rais' own arrogance that finally led to his downfall. In May of 1440, he became embroiled in a dispute with a priest named Jean Le Ferrand over a property dispute. In a fit of rage, Gilles and his men kidnapped the priest and imprisoned him in one of his castles. This was a fatal miscalculation. Kidnapping a common child was one thing. Abducting a man of the cloth was an attack on the church itself, an institution with power that rivaled and in many ways surpassed that of the nobility. The Bishop of Nantes, Jean de Malestroit, launched an immediate investigation. This gave a voice to the years of whispered rumors and suppressed fears.
People began to come forward telling stories of children who had gone to work for the marshal and never returned. The ecclesiastical court began to build a case, not just for the kidnapping of the priest, but for heresy, apostasy, and the summoning of demons. Crimes the church was far more equipped and motivated to prosecute than simple murder. The trial of Gilles de Rais was a sensation, held in October 1440. He was tried simultaneously by two courts, the ecclesiastical court for his spiritual crimes and a civil court presided over by the Duke of Brittany for murder and other secular offenses. Initially, Gilles was defiant. He was a marshal of France, and he refused to submit to the authority of a lesser court, spewing insults and threats at his accusers. But the weight of the evidence and the testimony of his captured accomplices was overwhelming. Under the threat of torture, a standard judicial tool of the time, his resolve crumbled. He broke down and offered a full, tearful confession, not just to the court, a select group of judges, but to the public, to the parents of the children he had murdered, begging for their prayers and forgiveness. His confession was a horrifying litany of depravity, detailing his methods, his motives, and his ritualistic practices. He spared no detail of the suffering he had inflicted. It was a performance of piety and penitence, perhaps genuine, perhaps a final act from a man who had lived his life as a grand theatrical production. On October 26, 1440, Gilles de Rais, hero of France, was executed. He was first hanged and then his body was burned, a punishment befitting both a murderer and a heretic. The story of Gilles de Rais is a chilling reminder that the capacity for monstrous evil is not confined to the shadows of society. It can wear a mask of heroism, wealth, and respectability. His case stands as one of the earliest documented examples of serial murder in Western history, a precursor to the aristocratic predators of Gothic fiction. And yet, outside of France and circles of historical true crime enthusiasts, his name is largely unknown. He is a footnote, eclipsed by his association with Joan of Arc, his evil too ancient, too fantastical to feel real to a modern audience. But for the people of 15th century Brittany, he was no myth. He was a real-life dragon, living in a castle, devouring their children. From the cold stone castles of medieval France, we travel forward 3 centuries and across the globe to a landscape that is its polar opposite, the hot, dusty, and vibrant expanse of 18th century India. Here, under the waning power of the Mughal Empire and the rising influence of the British East India Company, a different kind of evil flourished. It was not the solitary madness of a depraved nobleman, but an organized, disciplined, and terrifyingly efficient machinery of death, operating as a sacred duty. This was the world of the Thuggee. For centuries, this secret society of assassins and robbers terrorized the roads and highways of the Indian subcontinent. They were not common bandits who relied on brute force. They were masters of deception, infiltration, and silent, ritualistic murder. And at the apex of this murderous cult stood one man, a figure whose personal body count makes him one of the most prolific serial killers in all of human history. His name was Thug Behram. To understand Behram, one must first understand the Thuggee. The word thug in English derives directly from them, from the Hindi word thug, meaning deceiver. The Thuggee were a hereditary cult, with fathers passing down the dark trade to their sons. They operated in gangs, sometimes small, sometimes numbering in the hundreds, and their targets were travelers. India's vast network of roads was the lifeblood of commerce and pilgrimage, and it was here that the Thuggee plied their deadly trade. Their modus operandi was a masterpiece of patient, psychological terror. A gang of thugs would identify a group of travelers, merchants, soldiers, pilgrims, families, and then insinuate themselves into their party. They would pose as fellow travelers, sharing stories, food, and the hardships of the road for days, sometimes even weeks. They were charming, helpful, and utterly trustworthy. They became friends, companions, lulling their victims into a complete sense of security. This period of infiltration was crucial. It allowed the thugs to learn everything about their victims: how many were in their party, what valuables they carried, who was armed, and what their routines were. They would wait for the perfect moment, a time when the travelers were relaxed and unsuspecting. Usually it was at night, when the party had made camp in a secluded spot, often a place pre-selected by the thugs for its isolation. Then, at a signal from the gang's leader, the deception would end. Each thug had a designated target. The signal, often a phrase like "bring the tobacco," would unleash a sudden, coordinated, and shockingly silent wave of violence. The thug's signature weapon was the rumal, a yellow silk scarf or sash. In one swift practice movement, the scarf would be whipped around the victim's neck from behind, a knot pressed against the larynx, while another thug pulled the victim's legs out from under them. Death by strangulation was swift, silent, and bloodless. The killing was a sacred ritual. The Thuggee were fervent worshippers of Kali, the Hindu goddess of time, creation, and destruction. They believed they were her chosen instruments, culling humanity to maintain cosmic balance. Every murder was an offering to her. The yellow of the rumal was her sacred color, and the act of strangulation was believed to be a method of killing she had taught them, one that did not spill blood and thus did not defile the earth. After the murders, the work was not done. The Thuggee were meticulous. They had designated grave diggers who would have already prepared a pit. The bodies were stripped of all valuables and then ritually mutilated, their joints broken, their abdomens slashed, to prevent them from swelling and to hasten decomposition. They were then buried, the campsite was cleaned of all evidence, and by morning the thugs had vanished, leaving no trace that their victims had ever existed. This was the world Thug Behram was born into around 1765. He was a leader, a jemadar, within this terrifying organization. He was not just a participant, he was a master, a virtuoso of this deadly art. He was personally credited with strangling 125 men with his own rumal, and he was present as the leader who gave the signal at the murders of 931 people between 1790 and 1840. Let that number sink in. 931 murders. It is a figure that strains credulity, placing him in a category of lethality all his own. He operated for half a century, a ghost on the roads of India, leading his gang with ruthless efficiency. His success was a testament to his skill in deception, his understanding of human nature, and his unwavering devotion to the cult's bloody code. For centuries, the Thuggee operated with near impunity. The vastness of India, the lack of a centralized policing authority, and the sheer skill of the thugs in leaving no witnesses and no evidence made them almost impossible to combat. Entire caravans of people would simply vanish, swallowed by the road. Their disappearances were blamed on bandits, disease, or wild animals. The true, horrifying nature of the threat was a whispered legend, a story to frighten travelers, but its scale was not understood. This began to change in the 1830s with the expansion of British rule. The British East India Company, seeking to establish order and control over its territories, could not tolerate the lawlessness and disruption to trade that the Thuggee represented. A British civil servant named William Sleeman was appointed to head a new department, the Thuggee and Dacoity Department. His mission was simple: to eradicate the cult completely. Sleeman's campaign was one of the first large-scale, systematic efforts to combat an organized criminal enterprise in history. It was a fusion of intelligence gathering, law enforcement, and social engineering. He understood that he could not fight the Thuggee with force alone. They were too elusive, too deeply embedded in the local population. He needed to break their code of silence. He established a system of profiling, mapping their areas of operation and identifying their ritual burial sites. He offered captured thugs a deal: confess, become an informant and approver, and testify against your former comrades, and your life will be spared. Faced with the certainty of the gallows, many thugs turned. Suddenly, the British had a flood of intelligence, a detailed look inside the secret world of the cult. These approvers laid bare the entire structure of the Thuggee: their secret language, their signs and omens, their leadership, and, most importantly, the names of their members. The most valuable of these informants was a man named Feringhia, who provided detailed accounts of the cult's practices and led Sleeman's men to mass graves containing dozens of bodies. It was through this systematic dismantling of the organization that thug Behram was finally captured in 1840. He was an old man by then, in his 70s, his long reign of terror coming to an end. He readily confessed to his crimes, not with remorse, but with a kind of professional pride. He saw himself not as a murderer, but as a dedicated servant of his goddess, a man who had simply done his duty as his ancestors had before him. Behram was executed by hanging in 1840, and with him, the era of the thugs effectively came to a close. Over the course of Sleeman's campaign, more than 3,000 thugs were captured. Over 400 were hanged, and the rest were imprisoned for life or transported. The cult that had claimed tens of thousands, perhaps even hundreds of thousands of lives over centuries, was broken in just over a decade. Like Gilles de Rais, thug Behram's story has faded into obscurity for the Western world. His staggering victim count is almost too large to be personal, becoming a mere statistic. He was not a psychological enigma in the modern sense. His motives were rooted in a system of belief and tradition that is alien to us. His evil was not the product of a broken mind, but of a functioning, albeit horrifying, culture. He reminds us that serial murder is not always a pathology of the individual, but can sometimes be a pathology of a society, a dark tradition passed down through generations, leaving a trail of nameless, forgotten dead along the serpent's road. We now leap forward into the late 20th century to the sprawling archipelago of Indonesia. Our next subject is a man whose crimes are a grotesque fusion of ancient superstition and modern brutality. He was not a nobleman or a member of a secret cult. He was a cattle breeder and a self-proclaimed sorcerer, a man who held a position of respect and power in his community, a power he twisted to serve a nightmarish personal quest. His name was Ahmad Suradji, but he was better known as Nasib Kilewang, or the Datuk. Suradji lived in a small village outside Medan, the capital of North Sumatra. To his neighbors, he was a powerful shaman, a mystic who could offer charms and potions to make women more beautiful, to bring them wealth, or to secure the faithfulness of their husbands. In a region where belief in black magic, or ilmu hitam, remains a potent force in daily life, Suradji was a man people turned to for help. They came to his home seeking miracles, and what they found was a gruesome, ritualistic death. His killing spree began in 1986, and it was born, he claimed, from a dream. In this dream, the spirit of his deceased father came to him with a chilling prophecy and a command. His father told him that he needed to kill 70 women and drink their saliva. If he completed this gruesome task, he would attain supernatural powers, becoming invincible and a master of mystical knowledge. For Ahmad Suradji, this was not a metaphor or a psychotic delusion in the typical sense. It was a sacred mission. He embarked on his quest with a chilling sense of purpose, using his reputation as a shaman to lure his victims. Women from all over the region, desperate for help with their problems, would seek him out. He would welcome them, listen to their troubles, and promise them a powerful ritual that would solve everything. He would lead his unsuspecting victims to a sugarcane plantation near his home. There, he would tell them that as part of the magical ritual, they needed to be buried in the earth up to their waists.
This would allow their bodies to absorb the mystical energies of the ground. Trusting the respected sorcerer, the women would agree, allowing him to dig a hole and help them into it. Once they were trapped, helpless and buried to the waist, the ritual would take its horrifying turn. Suradji would wrap a length of cable around his victim's neck and strangle her. As she was dying, he would collect and drink her saliva, believing he was absorbing her life force, her spiritual energy, taking another step towards his goal of invincibility. But the ritual was not yet complete. After the victim was dead, he would pull her body from the hole, redress her, and then rebury her in the same pit. He was meticulously careful about the orientation of the body. Every single one of his victims was buried with her head pointing towards his house. He believed this would channel their power directly to him, further enhancing his magical abilities. For 11 years, from 1986 to 1997, Ahmad Suradji carried out these murders. His victims ranged in age from 11 to 30. They were women, they were girls, all of whom had come to him in a moment of vulnerability, seeking hope. He killed them methodically, one by one, their disappearances going largely unnoticed and unconnected. Much like the victims of Gilles de Rais and thug Behram, Suradji's victims were from the periphery of society. They were often poor, uneducated women whose lives were precarious. When they vanished, their families may have worried, but they had little recourse. Perhaps they had run off with a man or moved to the city to find work. The idea that the friendly local shaman was systematically murdering them was simply unthinkable. Suradji was also protected by his 3 wives, who were sisters. They were not just aware of his horrific activities, they were his accomplices. They helped him manage his clients, maintain his facade of respectability, and, most importantly, they helped him conceal the evidence of his crimes. Their complicity created a fortress of silence around his home, making his dark secret all but impenetrable. His reign of terror came to an end in April 1997, not through brilliant detective work, but through a grim stroke of luck. A villager discovered a decomposing body in the sugarcane plantation. The police were called and an investigation began. The body was identified as a 21-year-old woman named Sri Kamala Dewi, and witnesses reported that she had last been seen visiting Ahmad Suradji. When police went to his home to question him, they found some of the victim's belongings, her watch, her dress, and her bracelet. Suradji was arrested. Under interrogation, he did not just confess to the murder of Sri Kamala Dewi. He calmly and methodically confessed to everything. He told them about his father's dream, the quest for invincibility, the ritual, and the saliva. And then he led them back to the sugarcane plantation. What followed was a scene of unparalleled horror. For days, excavators dug up the fields surrounding Suradji's home. One after another, the skeletal remains of his victims were unearthed. The final count was 42 bodies. 42 women and girls, all buried in the same field. Their skulls all oriented in the same direction, pointing towards the house of the man who had murdered them. The trial of Ahmad Suradji and his 3 wives was a media sensation in Indonesia. He showed little remorse, maintaining that he was simply following the instructions from his dream. He was a man on a mission, and in his own twisted worldview, his actions were justified. In April 1998, he was found guilty and sentenced to death. His wives were also convicted, with his first wife receiving a death sentence, later commuted to life imprisonment, and the other 2 receiving long prison sentences. On July 10, 2008, after more than a decade on death row, Ahmad Suradji was executed by a firing squad. He never reached his goal of 70 victims. His quest for supernatural power ended in a hail of bullets. His story is a chilling illustration of how deeply held cultural beliefs can be perverted into a justification for monstrous acts. Outside of Southeast Asia, the case of the Indonesian sorcerer is virtually unknown.
It received minimal coverage in the Western press, dismissed perhaps as a bizarre fringe story from a distant land. But the brutality of his crimes and the sheer number of his victims place him firmly in the top echelon of serial murderers. His story is a testament to the fact that the landscape of human evil is far more varied and strange than we can possibly imagine, and that sometimes the most dangerous monsters are the ones who promise miracles. Our next case takes us back to the heart of Europe, but this is not a story of ancient superstition. It is a modern tale of psychological horror, a story of evil that festered behind the closed doors of a seemingly respectable family. It is a case that demonstrates how the most sacred bonds of trust, those between a pastor and his flock, a father and his children, can be twisted into instruments of absolute control and unspeakable violence. This is the story of András Pándy, the pastor who made his family disappear.
Pándy was born in Hungary in 1927 in a small village near Budapest. He grew up in a tumultuous period of European history, living through World War II and the subsequent Soviet takeover of his homeland. He became a pastor in the Protestant Reformed Church, but in 1957, following the failed Hungarian Revolution, he fled to Belgium as a refugee. There, he established himself as a respected figure, a man of God who ministered to the Hungarian expatriate community in Brussels.
He married, had children, and built a life that, from the outside, looked perfectly normal, even admirable. He was a charismatic and intelligent man, a pillar of his community. But beneath this veneer of piety, András Pándy was a tyrant. He ruled his home with an iron fist, subjecting his family to years of psychological, physical, and sexual abuse. He was a master manipulator, using religion and his paternal authority to isolate and control his wives and children. His first wife, Ilona, eventually managed to escape his control, divorcing him and taking their 3 children. Pándy then married his second wife, Edith, and had 4 more children with her. But the pattern of abuse continued. The family home was not a sanctuary. It was a prison where Pándy's word was absolute law and his whims were enforced through terror. One of his children, his daughter Agnes, from his first marriage, became central to the horror that was to unfold. After his first wife left, Pándy manipulated the situation to gain custody of Agnes. He subjected her to years of incestuous abuse, breaking her down psychologically until she was completely subservient to his will. She became not just his victim, but his loyal accomplice, a key player in the murders that would follow. The killings began in the mid-1980s. The motive was chillingly simple: control. Anyone in his family who defied him, who threatened to leave, or who simply became an inconvenience was marked for death. In 1986, his second wife, Edith, and her 2 children from a previous marriage disappeared. Pándy told friends and authorities that she had left him, taking her children and running off with another man. 2 years later, in 1988, his first wife, Ilona, and her other 2 children, Daniel and Tunda, also vanished. Again, Pándy had a story ready. He claimed they had decided to move away, to start a new life elsewhere. He even went so far as to force his daughter Agnes and his other children to write postcards and letters supposedly from the missing family members, which he would then mail from different countries during his travels. It was a calculated and cruel deception designed to create a false trail and silence any questions. For years, the facade held. People believed him. He was a grieving husband and father, abandoned by 2 wives. He played the part of the victim perfectly. But the truth was far more gruesome. His wives and children had not left. They had been murdered inside the family's homes in Brussels, killed by Pándy with the help of his enthralled daughter Agnes. The method of disposal was as cold and methodical as the murders themselves. Pándy was determined to leave no trace of his victims. He dismembered their bodies in his bathroom. Then, using powerful industrial-strength drain cleaners and other corrosive acids, he dissolved the remains. Some body parts were cooked to separate the flesh from the bone, and the resulting slurry was flushed down the toilet. Larger bones and anything that wouldn't dissolve were wrapped in plastic and dumped with the trash, or taken to a local slaughterhouse to be disposed of with animal remains. It was a horrifyingly efficient system for making people vanish from the face of the earth. For over a decade, András Pándy got away with it. He continued to preach, to counsel his congregation, and to live his life as a respected clergyman, all while harboring the darkest of secrets in the basement beneath his feet. The web of lies began to unravel in 1992 when Agnes, who had by then entered into a sham marriage arranged by her father, finally broke down. She confessed to her new husband that she had been in an incestuous relationship with her father and that he had murdered several members of their family. The man was horrified and went to the police. But incredibly, the initial investigation went nowhere. Pándy was a respected figure, and Agnes's story was so monstrous it seemed unbelievable. She later retracted her statement, likely under pressure from her father. It wasn't until 1997 that the case was reopened, this time with more determination. Belgian police, perhaps spurred by the high-profile case of another Belgian monster, Marc Dutroux, launched a full-scale investigation. They searched Pándy's properties, using forensic techniques that were not available years earlier. In the basement of one of his homes, they made a grim discovery. While the acid had done its work, it had not been perfect. Deep within the septic system and concrete foundations, they found traces of human fat and bone fragments. Faced with this evidence and a renewed police focus, Agnes confessed again, this time for good. She laid out the entire horrific story, the abuse, the murders, her role as an accomplice, and the gruesome method of disposal. Pándy was arrested. He denied everything, maintaining his innocence with the same calm demeanor he had used to deceive everyone for years. He claimed it was all a conspiracy, a fabrication by his vengeful daughter. But the evidence, combined with Agnes's detailed testimony, was damning. The trial in 2002 captivated Belgium. It exposed the dark reality behind the respectable facade of the pastor. András Pándy was found guilty of the murder of 6 family members, his 2 wives and 4 of his children. He was sentenced to life in prison. His daughter Agnes, for her role as an accomplice, received a 21-year sentence. Pándy never showed a shred of remorse. He died in prison in 2013, taking his secrets and his defiant claims of innocence to the grave. His case is a chilling study in psychological manipulation and the evil that can hide behind a cloak of religion and respectability. Despite the horrific nature of his crimes, familicide, incest, and the chemical dissolution of his victims, the story of András Pándy is not widely known outside of Belgium and Hungary. It was a domestic horror, a family secret that, once exposed, was perhaps too disturbing for the global true crime narrative, which often favors the stories of predators who hunt strangers. Pándy's evil was intimate, a corruption of the very idea of family, and for that reason, it remains one of history's most unsettling and forgotten tales. We now travel to the world's most populous nation, China, at the turn of the 21st century. This is a country undergoing seismic economic and social change, a place where sprawling megacities rise next to vast rural landscapes that have remained unchanged for centuries. It was in these quiet rural provinces that one of the most ferocious and prolific serial killers of modern times conducted a 4-year reign of terror. He was not a sorcerer or a pastor. He was a simple drifter, filled with a bottomless rage, who became known as the Monster Killer. His name was Yang Xinhai. Yang's story is not one of complex psychological manipulation or ritualistic belief. It is a story of pure, unadulterated, and explosive violence. Between 1999 and 2003, he rampaged across 4 central Chinese provinces, Anhui, Hebei, Hainan, and Shandong. He moved like a phantom through the countryside, targeting the most vulnerable, peasant families asleep in their isolated farmhouses. His attacks were characterized by a level of brutality that is almost impossible to comprehend. His method was brutally consistent. He would break into a home in the dead of night, armed with the tools of the very people he was about to slaughter: axes, meat cleavers, hammers, and shovels. He would then proceed to kill every single person inside, men, women, and children, bludgeoning them to death as they slept. He moved from room to room, from bed to bed, in a frenzy of violence, leaving entire families annihilated in a matter of minutes. In total, Yang Xinhai murdered 67 people and committed 23 rapes. The sheer savagery of the crime scenes he left behind was shocking even to seasoned investigators. He was not just killing, he was exterminating. In one case, he murdered a family of 4 and then, before leaving, bludgeoned their dog to death as well. It was an act of total annihilation, erasing any sign of life from the homes he invaded. What could motivate such indiscriminate and hyper-violent rage? Yang's background provides some clues, though it falls short of fully explaining the monster he became. He was born into a poor family and had a limited education. As a young man, he left his village to find work, becoming part of China's vast population of migrant laborers. He had a criminal record, having served time in labor camps for theft and attempted rape. According to his own confession, the catalyst for his killing spree was a breakup. A girlfriend had left him, he said, because of his previous prison sentences. This rejection seems to have ignited a deep-seated hatred for society, a desire for revenge against a world he felt had wronged him. He decided to exact this revenge not through targeted attacks, but by inflicting the maximum amount of pain and suffering on random, innocent people. He chose to kill for the sake of killing. For 4 years, Yang was a ghost. He was a transient with no fixed address, which made him incredibly difficult to track. The provinces he operated in are vast and heavily populated, but the rural areas are a patchwork of small villages and isolated farms. He could move easily between them, his presence going largely unnoticed. He was also cunning. To throw off police, he would often wear oversized shoes and wrap them in cloth to obscure his tracks. The investigation into the so-called monster killer was one of the largest in modern Chinese history, but it was hampered by several factors. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, forensic technology and interprovincial police cooperation in China were not as advanced as they are today. Linking a series of murders across 4 different provincial jurisdictions, committed by a killer who left few clues, was a monumental task. Furthermore, the state-controlled nature of the Chinese media meant that the full extent of the panic and terror was not widely reported. While local communities were gripped by fear, there was no national media frenzy of the kind that would accompany such a killing spree in the West. This lack of public information, while intended to prevent panic, may have also made it easier for Yang to continue his rampage, as people in one province were unaware of the similar attacks happening in another. Yang's downfall came not as the result of a brilliant investigative breakthrough, but through a routine police check. In November 2003, he was stopped by police in Guangzhou, a city in Hebei province. He was acting suspiciously, and when the police questioned him, his nervous behavior and inconsistent answers led them to detain him for further interrogation. Once in custody, they ran his fingerprints and discovered he was wanted for questioning in connection with murders in the neighboring province of Henan. They also took a sample of his DNA. When they compared it to DNA evidence recovered from multiple crime scenes across the 4 provinces, they got a match. They had found their monster. Faced with the irrefutable DNA evidence, Yang Xinhai confessed to everything. He calmly recounted his 4-year campaign of terror, admitting to 67 murders. His trial was swift. In February 2004, he was found guilty and sentenced to death. He expressed no remorse for his actions. Just days later, on February 14, 2004, Yang Xinhai was executed by a single gunshot to the back of the head. His case is a stark reminder of the raw, explosive potential of human rage. He was not driven by supernatural beliefs or complex psychological needs for control in the same way as our other subjects. He was, in his own words, motivated by a simple and terrifying desire for revenge on the world. He chose his victims for their accessibility, their vulnerability a symbol of the society he despised. The story of Yang Xinhai remains largely unknown outside of China. The combination of state-controlled media, the language barrier, and a general lack of Western focus on Chinese domestic crime has kept his horrific story confined. Yet his brutality and victim count easily place him among the most savage serial killers of the modern era. He was a storm of violence that swept through the heart of China, a monster who emerged from the quiet plains to leave an unforgettable scar on the nation's memory. For our final and perhaps most disturbing story, we travel to South America, to the nation of Colombia in the 1990s. This was a country in turmoil, a place torn apart by decades of civil war, powerful drug cartels, and deep-seated poverty. It was a landscape of chaos and violence where the state's authority was weak and life was cheap. And in this perfect storm of societal breakdown, the most prolific serial killer of children in recorded history conducted a reign of terror that almost went completely unnoticed. He is known as La Bestia, the Beast. His name is Luis Garavito. Garavito's victim count is so vast it seems fictional. He confessed to the torture, rape, and murder of 193 boys, but the true number is believed to be well over 300. He is, by any measure, one of the deadliest human predators to have ever lived. The story of how he was able to kill on such an industrial scale for so long is inextricably linked to the tragic circumstances of the country he haunted. His victims were the most vulnerable members of Colombian society: poor, rural children, street kids, orphans, and those displaced by the ongoing conflict between the government, paramilitary groups, and FARC rebels. These were children on the margins, often without parents or guardians to look out for them. They were, in the eyes of a broken society, disposable. Their disappearances, if noted at all, were just another sad statistic in a country already drowning in death. Garavito exploited this vulnerability with chilling expertise. He was a chameleon, using a variety of disguises and ruses to lure his victims. He would pose as a monk, a charity worker, a street vendor, or even a disabled person, roles designed to elicit sympathy and trust. He would approach the boys, who ranged in age from 6 to 16, and offer them money, a small gift, or a soft drink. To a child who had nothing, these small kindnesses were irresistible. Once he had gained their trust, he would lead them away on long walks, often into secluded rural areas. When they were tired, disoriented, and completely isolated, the friendly stranger would transform into a monster. He would tie them up, torture them for hours, sexually assault them, and then, finally, slit their throats or stab them in the neck. He was a sadist who reveled in the fear and pain of his victims. For years, he moved across Colombia, leaving a trail of death in more than 50 different towns and cities. His transient lifestyle made him almost impossible to track. But even as the number of missing children began to climb, the authorities were slow to connect the cases. The country's law enforcement was overwhelmed, focused on the war against the drug cartels and left-wing guerrillas. The disappearance of a few street children was simply not a priority. It wasn't until the late 1990s that the horrifying scale of the problem began to emerge. Mass graves started being discovered. In Pereira, the bodies of 25 boys were found buried in a shallow pit. Near Geneva, another grave yielded 15 more. As investigators began to unearth these sites of unimaginable horror across the country, they realized they were not dealing with isolated incidents. They were hunting a single, monstrous predator. The break in the case came in April 1999. Garavito was arrested for the attempted rape of a boy. Initially, police had no idea who they had in custody. But as the investigation into the mass graves intensified, and as a composite sketch of the suspected killer was circulated, investigators realized the man sitting in their jail cell was the monster they were looking for. His face matched the descriptions given by several children who had narrowly escaped his clutches. Confronted with the evidence, Luis Garavito confessed. He did not just admit to the crimes, he seemed to relish recounting them. With a horrifyingly calm and detailed memory, he led investigators to dozens of his burial sites. He walked through the fields and hills, pointing out the exact spots where he had left his victims. Without his cooperation, the final resting places of hundreds of boys would likely have never been found. He claimed his actions were driven by a childhood of horrific abuse and a deep-seated rage. While this may be true, it does nothing to mitigate the sheer scale and sadism of his crimes. His confession sent a shockwave through Colombia and the world. How could one man have killed so many for so long without being stopped? The answer is a tragic indictment of the society at the time. The civil conflict had created a generation of displaced and forgotten children, a perfect hunting ground for a predator like Garavito. The lack of a national missing persons database, poor communication between regional police forces, and the general chaos of the country all contributed to the failure to identify the pattern of his crimes sooner. But perhaps the most shocking part of Garavito's story came after his conviction. Despite confessing to nearly 200 murders, he was sentenced to a maximum of 40 years in prison, the highest penalty allowed under Colombian law at the time. Because he cooperated with authorities, his sentence was further reduced to just 22 years. This meant that one of the most prolific child killers in history could have been eligible for release as early as 2021. This possibility sparked outrage in Colombia. The thought of La Bestia walking free was unthinkable for the families of his victims and the nation he had terrorized. Laws were changed and legal maneuvers were employed to ensure he remained behind bars. In October of 2023, while still incarcerated, Luis Garavito died of cancer, finally ending the possibility that he would ever be free again. The case of Luis Garavito is a harrowing example of how societal collapse can create a vacuum where unimaginable evil can flourish. His name is not as well known as Bundy or Dahmer, despite his victim count dwarfing theirs. His story was overshadowed by the larger narrative of Colombia's wars. His victims were voiceless. He is the ultimate monster from the shadows, a killer whose evil was so profound it almost escaped history's notice entirely. He is a chilling final testament to the brutal killers that we have, for too long, chosen not to see. From a medieval French castle to the battle-scarred fields of Colombia, we have journeyed through the darkest corners of human history. We have met the nobleman, the cultist, the sorcerer, the pastor, the monster, and the beast. Their stories are separated by centuries and continents, by culture and custom. Yet they are all bound by a common thread, a capacity for extreme brutality, and a place in the shadows of our collective memory. These forgotten monsters teach us a crucial lesson about the nature of evil. It is not a uniquely modern or Western phenomenon. It does not always come in the guise of the psychologically complex, media-savvy killer. Sometimes it is ancient and aristocratic. Sometimes it is organized and ritualistic. And sometimes it is born from superstition or from the explosive rage of a man with nothing to lose. The obscurity of these killers also forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about ourselves, about what stories we choose to tell and which victims we choose to remember. The media spotlight often favors crimes that are close to home, that are sensational in a familiar way, and whose victims are relatable to a broad audience. The stories of peasant children in 15th century France, of travelers on the roads of colonial India, or of street kids in war-torn Colombia do not fit this mold.
Their suffering has been relegated to the footnotes of history. But there is also a story of progress here. The world that allowed a Gilles de Rais or a thug Behram to operate with impunity for decades is not the world of today. The rise of forensic science, from the first arsenic tests that could have convicted Marianne Cotton to the DNA databases that unmasked Yang Xinhai, has made it increasingly difficult for killers to hide. Global communication and improved law enforcement cooperation mean that a predator's hunting ground is no longer limitless.
Yet, even now, monsters can still operate in the shadows. Samuel Little, the most prolific serial killer in U.S. history, murdered as many as 93 women over 35 years, his crimes going unconnected precisely because he preyed on the marginalized. Sex workers and drug users whose deaths were often not even classified as homicides. He proved that even in the modern era, victimology remains the killer's greatest shield.
By unearthing these forgotten stories, we do more than simply catalog the horrors of the past. We honor the memory of the nameless and forgotten victims. We acknowledge that their lives had value and that the injustice of their deaths should not be compounded by the injustice of our silence. And we arm ourselves with a more complete, more global, and ultimately more terrifying understanding of the darkness that human beings are capable of. The most important lesson these shadows can teach us is that we must never stop looking into them.